Han Seo-jun lifted the fork to his mouth for the first time in 11 months, without checking it for poison first. He didn't notice he'd done it until the food was already on his tongue, until the heat and the smoke and the sweetness hit him so hard his hand actually shook. His head of security stood frozen by the door, waiting for the scream, the collapse, the alarm. It never came. Instead, the most feared man in Ridgeport closed his eyes at his own dinner table and made a sound that had nothing to do with fear at all. "Who made this?" he asked, voice rough. "The new girl, sir." "The one from the agency. Bring her to me. We're going back 6 days to show you exactly how a woman who couldn't afford a callback interview ended up being the only person alive who could get Han Seo-jun to put down his gun and pick up a spoon. "But before we get there, I need something from you. If you've made it this far into one of my stories before and never hit subscribe, that ends today. I write these chapters alone at night for free because I love giving you something to disappear into. All I ask in return is 30 seconds of your time. Hit subscribe, drop a like, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Do that now because once this story starts, you will not want to stop to do it later. Welcome back to TasteRomance Stories. Let's begin. The 47th chef left the Cascade Tower penthouse in the back of a private ambulance, and Sarah had a sick feeling she was about to become the 48th. She stood in the middle of a kitchen that looked like it had been designed by a surgeon instead of a chef, brushed steel, imported marble, not a single crumb or fingerprint anywhere. She'd signed a stack of paperwork thick enough to double as a doorstop just to get past the service elevator, including a non-disclosure agreement written in language dense enough that she'd needed a lawyer friend to explain 3 separate clauses over the phone the night before. 2 guards had patted her down like she was walking into a courthouse instead of a kitchen. She didn't know the name of the man who owned this place. The staffing agency that placed her hadn't offered it, and something about the way the recruiter's voice had gone careful and quiet when Sarah asked told her not to push. All she knew was 2 things. The salary would clear her father's entire debt to the casino by the end of the month, and her new employer expected perfection with 0 tolerance for anything less. The menu taped to the steel prep counter called for a clarified consommé, a dish that demanded exact temperatures, exact timing, and absolutely no soul. Sarah stared at the pale, simmering stock in front of her and felt something in her chest twist with something close to grief. She hadn't dropped out of culinary school and spent 4 years building a reputation on flavor and instinct just to strain the personality out of a pot of broth for a man too rich to know the difference. The chill of the penthouse was already crawling under her skin. She needed heat. She needed something that tasted like it had a heartbeat. She thought about her father as she stood there. The way she'd found him 3 weeks ago, slumped at the kitchen table with a stack of unopened envelopes and a look on his face she'd never seen before. Not shame, exactly, but something closer to resignation, like a man who had already decided how his own story ended. She thought about the recruiter's voice going tight and careful on the phone, about the number on the contract that had made her hands shake when she signed it. She hadn't taken this job because she wanted to prove anything to a stranger with more money than sense. She'd taken it because it was the only door still open, and she didn't have the luxury of being picky about which fire she walked into. She balled up the printed menu and threw it in the trash. She wasn't going to serve a bowl of nothing to a man who'd apparently fired every chef in the city. If she was going down, she'd go down cooking something that actually meant something. Sarah raided the walk-in like she owned it. Thick oxtail, garlic, root vegetables, a whole shelf of things too good for a broth that was supposed to taste like water with ambition. From her own beat-up canvas knife roll, the one personal item security had let her keep after turning it inside out twice, she pulled 2 small, unlabeled jars. One packed with deep red Korean gochugaru, the other holding her grandmother's spice blend from back home, a warm, smoky mix of allspice Scotch bonnet. And time that Sarah's mother used to say could raise the dead. For the next 2 hours, the sterile kitchen stopped being sterile. The air went thick with searing meat and blooming spice. The broth turned to dark, glossy mahogany, simmering low and slow into something unapologetically spicy, unapologetically hers, 2 continents in one pot, built to warm a person from the inside out. It was, she knew even as she plated it, an act of defiance in a bowl. 2 floors above her, Han Seo-jun sat at the head of a long mahogany table, in a suit that had probably cost more than her father's car. He was the head of the Beekdu Combine, the syndicate that ran half of Ridgeport's underworld from behind a wall of lawyers and shell companies most people didn't even know existed. He was composed entirely of discipline and suspicion, a man who trusted almost no one and had the scars, visible and invisible, to justify it. He'd fired 47 chefs in the last year. Some left with generous severance. A few had been escorted out by his enforcers after his security team caught something in the food that made his stomach turn, a metallic edge, a chemical sweetness. Something wrong enough to set off years of trained instinct. He expected betrayal the way other people expected rain. He tasted for it in everything. When the heavy dining room doors opened and his head of security carried in a covered dish, Seo-jun's first thought was that something was off before the lid even came up. This wasn't the odorless, colorless consommé he'd ordered. What hit the air was bold, heat and smoke, and something warm and unfamiliar underneath it. His guards moved before he did, hands going for their holsters. An unauthorized dish wasn't just a mistake in this house, it was a threat. "Don't touch it," his lieutenant warned, hand hovering near his weapon. "I'll deal with the kitchen personally." Seo-jun looked down at the dark, glistening stew. Something cold and sharp coiled in his gut. Another one, he thought. Another person who thought they knew better than him. "Put them away," he said quietly, and the room obeyed instantly, the way it always did. He didn't need armed men to protect him from a bowl of soup. He picked up the spoon himself. He'd take one bite, confirm it was garbage, and go downstairs to make sure whoever had disobeyed him understood exactly what that meant. He took the bite. The heat hit first, sharp, layered, alive. Then came the depth underneath it, an earthy warmth he'd never tasted before folded into something that felt unmistakably, impossibly like Korean comfort food. It didn't taste like a five-star kitchen. It tasted like a memory he didn't actually have, a home he'd never gotten to keep. The spoon slipped out of his hand and clattered against the porcelain. Seo-jun closed his eyes, his chest rising and falling in a way that had nothing to do with anger. "Bring the chef to me," he said, and his voice came out rougher than he meant it to. Downstairs, Sarah was wiping down the counter when the kitchen doors slammed open hard enough to rattle the hinges. Two men in dark suits didn't say a word. They simply flanked her and walked her toward the private elevator, their grip firm enough that arguing felt pointless. Her heart hammered, the debt, the ambulance, the 47th chef. The elevator doors opened onto a dim, sprawling dining room, and they pushed her forward hard enough that she had to catch herself. She straightened, glaring at the men before turning to face the head of the table. She'd expected an old man in a bad toupee. Instead, she found herself looking into a pair of dark eyes, so intense they made the air in the room feel thinner. He radiated a kind of stillness that was somehow more unsettling than shouting would have been. Sarah didn't flinch. She lifted her chin. She was still in her stained chef's coat, a curl of dark hair escaping her braid, a smear of flour on her cheek she hadn't noticed until right now. She looked completely out of place among the armed men and the marble, and she stood there anyway, refusing to look sorry for the pot of fire she'd just served him. Seo-jun studied the flour on her cheek. He caught the scent of spice still clinging to her skin, mixed with the sharp edge of her adrenaline, and something in his chest that had been dormant for years sat up and paid attention. The silence stretched heavy and absolute. The only sound was Sarah's own pulse, too loud in her ears. "What is your name?" His voice was low, gravel dragged over stone. "Sarah," she said, surprising herself with how steady it came out, "and I was hired to cook, not to get dragged out of my kitchen by your bodyguards." A muscle moved in his jaw. He stood, unfolding to a height that made the room feel smaller, and crossed the distance between them with an unhurried, deliberate grace. "You are no longer an employee," he said. "You do not clock in and out of this house. You belong to this estate now. You will not be leaving." Sarah let out a short, disbelieving laugh. "Excuse me. I signed an NDA, not a lease on my whole life. I'm leaving right now." She turned on her heel, already planning her route back to the kitchen, her bag, the door. "Take her phone," Seo-jun said, without raising his voice at all. "Take her ID, lock the elevators. Only I authorize access." Before Sarah could process the words, the two men beside her moved. One clamped a hand on her shoulder with terrifying ease. The other reached into her coat pocket and pulled out her phone. "Hey, get off me." She twisted against the grip, but it didn't budge an inch. Panic finally cracked through her anger. "You can't do this. This is kidnapping." I am Han Seo-jun, he said, stepping close enough that he filled her entire field of vision. He smelled like cedar and cold night air. I can do whatever I choose in this city. Your father, Marcus Monroe, owes the Silver Peacock Casino $2 million, a debt he was foolish enough to bet his own safety against. The blood drained out of Sarah's face. I bought that debt 10 minutes ago, Seo-jun said, and it wasn't entirely true yet, but it would be true within the hour. He needed leverage, something to anchor her here, while he worked out why some human woman's cooking had cracked something open in his chest that hadn't moved in over a decade. You are my personal chef now, Miss Sarah. You cook for me and only me. In exchange, your father keeps breathing, but you do not leave this penthouse. Do we understand each other? You're a monster, she whispered, her voice shaking with fury rather than fear. I am exactly what you need me to be, he murmured, his gaze dropping briefly to her mouth before snapping back up. Take her to the East Wing. They practically carried her out. Sarah kicked, shouted, threatened them with everything from lawyers to God, and then the heavy doors of the East Wing suite closed behind her with a click that felt like a verdict. She was trapped. The room itself was a masterpiece, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the glittering skyline, a bed the size of a small boat, marble everywhere. To Sarah, it was nothing but a beautiful cage. She paced it for hours, replaying every decision that had led her here. The shady staffing agency, the too good salary, her father's addiction finally catching up to both of them at once. She hadn't known she was walking into the private fortress of the most dangerous man in the city's underworld. By the time morning light broke over the skyline, Sarah had made a decision. She wasn't going to be a victim in this story. She'd survived 4 years of a brutal culinary program that chewed up half its students and spat out the rest. She'd survived her father's gambling, his lies, his disappearances. She would survive this too. At 7 a.m., the lock on her door clicked open. A guard gestured for her to follow. The boss wants breakfast, he said flatly, taking up a post by the elevator. Sarah looked at the gleaming kitchen, the fully stocked walk-in, the espresso machine that probably cost more than her car, and a slow, defiant smile spread across her face. Does he? She made herself an espresso first, taking her time. Then she toasted a thick slice of artisan bread, slathered it in butter, hopped up onto the marble island, crossed her legs, and ate her breakfast in complete, unbothered silence. 30 minutes later, the kitchen doors banged open hard enough to rattle. Seo-jun strode in wearing dark slacks and an unbuttoned black shirt, and the temperature in the room seemed to actually drop. He took in the empty stove, then turned his dark gaze on Sarah, calmly sipping her espresso. Where is my food? I don't know. Did you check the fridge? She took a deliberate bite of toast. There's probably some leftover caviar in there for you to snack on. His eyes flashed. I gave you an order, and I gave you my resignation, Sarah shot back, swinging her legs against the cabinets. I don't cook for kidnappers. I don't cook on command like a dog. You want to keep me locked up here, fine, but you can't make me pick up a knife. So unless you're planning on starving, I'd suggest a delivery app. A low growl rumbled through the kitchen, something that didn't quite sound human. The guard by the elevator lowered his eyes to the floor and went very still. In a fraction of a second, Seo-jun closed the distance between them. Before Sarah could gasp, his hands slammed onto the counter on either side of her thighs, caging her in. He leaned close, his face inches from hers, heat radiating off him like an open furnace. You like games, he said, low and dangerous. You think because I let your little act of defiance slide last night, you hold some kind of power here. Sarah's breath hitched. She couldn't lean back, the counter edge dug into her spine. She could smell cedar and something sharp and electric underneath it that made her head spin. I think, she forced out, refusing to look away, that you're a bully who doesn't know how to handle someone telling you no. His gaze dropped, briefly, to her throat, where her pulse jumped wildly. I could take everything from you, he whispered, brushing a stray curl away from her face, the touch shockingly gentle against the threat in his voice. Until you begged me to let you cook. Do it then, she challenged, voice trembling but her chin still lifted. Break me. For a long, charged moment, neither of them moved. Then, abruptly, Seo-jun pushed himself back, turning away and dragging a hand through his hair, his shoulders rigid with some battle Sarah couldn't see. Dinner is at 8, he said, voice flat again, all emotion locked back down. A full-course meal. I've assigned a sous chef to assist you. If it isn't on the table by 8, I will make one phone call, and your father will lose a hand. He walked out without waiting for a response, leaving Sarah trembling on the counter, gasping for air like he'd taken all of it with him. By 6 that evening, the kitchen was a storm of controlled chaos. Sarah had surrendered to the situation, but she was doing it entirely on her own terms. If she was going to be a prisoner, she'd at least be the undisputed queen of her cell. She threw herself into a multi-course menu built around the bold flavors she did best, grateful for the distraction from everything else, including the unsettling, humiliating way her body had reacted to him that morning. Her assigned sous chef was a quiet young man named Julian, efficient, soft-spoken, never quite meeting her eyes. He moved through the kitchen like a shadow. "I need the duck seared skin side down, medium heat," Sarah ordered, moving between a reduction on the stove and a tray of roasted vegetables. "Don't rush the fat render." "Yes, chef," Julian murmured. She moved to the island to plate the appetizer, a beef carpaccio with citrus ponzu and shaved parmesan, an elegant nod to the fine dining world Seojun was used to, elevated with her own touch. Julian approached with a small dark bottle. "He requires white truffle oil on the carpaccio, chef. It's non-negotiable," Sarah frowned. She hated synthetic truffle oil, cheap, overpowering, an insult to good ingredients, but she was already testing her luck. "Fine," she sighed, holding out her hand. "Give it here." Julian hesitated a beat too long before handing it over. "I can finish it, chef. You should watch the duck." "I said I'll do it." Her authority in a kitchen wasn't up for debate. She uncorked the bottle, and the smell that hit her wasn't the earthy mushroom scent she expected. Underneath the artificial truffle was something else. Metallic, bitter, wrong. Her palate had always been her best instrument. She could pick apart a dozen spices in a blind test. She dipped the tip of her finger to the rim and touched it to her tongue. The reaction was immediate and violent, a sharp chemical burn, a numbness that triggered her gag reflex instantly. It tasted like poison. She spat into the sink, coughing, shoving her mouth under running water, heart slamming against her ribs. She turned to find Julian, but he was gone. So was the plated carpaccio. "No," she breathed, and then she was running. She burst through the dining room doors just as Julian set the silver plate down in front of Seojun, who was already reaching for his fork. "Don't eat that," Sarah screamed, vaulting a side table, her coat flying. Seojun's head snapped up. Julian spun around, eyes wide with panic at the sight of her charging in, very much alive. Sarah didn't stop to explain. There wasn't time. She threw her body across the last few feet of space and tackled Han Seojun clean out of his chair. They crashed to the hardwood floor in a tangle of limbs, Sarah landing hard on his chest and knocking the breath out of him. Above them, the room exploded into chaos. Julian yanked a suppressed handgun from his waistband and fired wildly at the spot where they'd fallen. Bullets tore into the mahogany table, sending shattered china raining down. Seojun roared and rolled, pinning Sarah beneath his own body to shield her from the gunfire. "Take him alive," he bellowed, and his enforcers moved instantly, weapons drawn, the room filling with the sharp crack of return fire. Julian scrambled for the windows, firing blind. 2 rounds caught him in the shoulder and thigh before he made it. He went down screaming, and within seconds his men had him pinned and zip-tied. Silence slammed back into the room, ringing and absolute. Beneath Seojun, Sarah lay trembling, eyes squeezed shut, her heart hammering against her ribs like it might burst through. Slowly he lifted himself off her, and for a long moment he simply looked down at the woman who had thrown herself between him and a bullet, who hated him, who was his prisoner, and who had just very nearly died, saving his life. The penthouse turned into a fortress in the space of an hour. Steel shutters sealed the windows. The number of armed guards tripled. Julian was dragged, bleeding, to a soundproofed room downstairs, and Seojun's orders were absolute. No one in, no one out. The lockdown stretched into its 3rd day, and the air in the penthouse thickened into something Sarah couldn't quite name, something more dangerous than the fear of a hidden assassin. This had stopped being a standoff between a crime lord and his enemies. It had become something far more personal, playing out entirely in the confines of a marble kitchen. Seojun refused to let her out of his sight. The rational part of him called it security. She was a witness, a liability, the only person who'd ever caught the poison before it reached his mouth. But there was another part of him, quieter and far more insistent, that simply couldn't stand the idea of distance between them. Instead of leaving her isolated, he moved his entire operation into the kitchen. Sarah tried to ignore him. She turned the space into her territory, cooking with restless, furious energy, chopping, searing, simmering, anything to keep her hands busy, but it was impossible to tune him out. He commandeered the 10-foot marble island as his command center, sitting there in dark slacks with a laptop and a stack of files, dismantling rival operations in a low, merciless voice while she worked 12 feet away, listening despite herself. He was a tyrant in an unbuttoned dress shirt. And yet, when the calls ended and the screens went dark, something in the room shifted, a tension that had nothing to do with business and everything to do with the way his eyes tracked her across the kitchen. The way she caught herself watching the line of his shoulders when his back was turned. He watched her without pretending not to. He watched the way her hands moved when she deboned a quail, quick and sure, like the knife was an extension of her fingers. He watched the stray curl that always escaped her braid by mid-afternoon, resting against the back of her neck. He watched the flush that climbed her throat when she leaned over a pot of simmering broth, and something low and unfamiliar tightened in his chest every time. Sarah noticed him noticing. She told herself it didn't matter, that she was cataloging his habits purely out of self-preservation, the way he rubbed his temple when a migraine crept in. The muscle that jumped in his jaw when a phone call went badly, the exhaustion he never let anyone else see. She told herself that, and she almost believed it, right up until the moment their hands brushed reaching for the same knife, and neither of them pulled away fast enough to pretend it hadn't happened. They were two people circling each other in a locked room, both fully aware it was only a matter of time before one of them stopped pretending. If your chest is already tight for these two, wait until you see what happens at 2 in the morning. Before we get there, if this story's got you hooked, do me a favor and drop a like right now so I know to keep writing these. It genuinely keeps this channel alive. Okay, back to the kitchen. It happened on the 5th night of the lockdown. The oven clock glowed 2:14 a.m. in angry red digits. The penthouse was tomb silent, the guards stationed in the outer hallways, the kitchen left completely alone. Sarah couldn't sleep. Between the adrenaline, the captivity, and the maddening pull of Han Seo-jun, her nervous system had given up trying to make sense of anything. She crept down to the kitchen, chasing the only therapy she trusted anymore, cooking something simple and honest, not fine dining, comfort food. A cast-iron skillet rendered down cubes of smoked pork belly, while a pot of hand-pulled noodles simmered in a deep, savory bone broth loaded with roasted garlic, charred scallion, and gochujang. The kitchen filled with the smell of smoke and salt and something that felt impossibly like home. "You're awake," a voice said behind her, and she nearly dropped her knife. Seo-jun stood in the doorway, barefoot, in soft gray sweatpants and a fitted black t-shirt, his hair falling loose over his forehead in a way that made him look almost boyish. It caught her off guard so badly her pulse skipped. "You startled me," she managed, turning back to the counter to hide the heat climbing up her neck. "Couldn't sleep," he murmured, crossing the kitchen. He bypassed his laptop entirely and went straight for the liquor cabinet, pouring a measure of scotch into a heavy tumbler before leaning against the counter, watching her over the rim of the glass. "What are you making?" "Noodles, pork belly." "It's not on the approved list your security team gave me. I don't care about the list." The exhaustion in his voice went bone deep, not physical fatigue, but something older, heavier. Sarah stopped chopping and actually looked at him, and the anger that usually powered every interaction between them quietly drained out of her chest, replaced by something that scared her far more. Without a word, she pulled down a second bowl and divided the broth, the noodles, the crisped pork, splitting it evenly. She carried both bowls to the island, set one in front of him, and instead of sitting across from him like a stranger, she took the stool beside him. Seo-jun stared at the bowl for a long moment. His knuckles went white around his glass. "It's not poisoned," Sarah said gently, picking up her chopsticks. "I promise." He let out a rough, uneven breath. "I know it isn't. If you wanted me dead, you'd have let Julian finish the job." He looked at her. "Why didn't you, Sarah?" It was the first time he'd used her name. Hearing it in that low, gravel voice sent a shiver straight through her. "I don't know," she admitted honestly. "I saw the tray. I tasted the oil. My body just moved before my brain could tell me how stupid it was to save the man who kidnapped me." A ghost of a smile, bitter and small, touched his mouth. He picked up the chopsticks and ate. Sarah watched the tension in his shoulders drop, fraction by fraction, as if the food were undoing something a decade in the tying. "I've fired 47 chefs this year," he said quietly, staring into the broth. "My men think I'm losing my mind. They think the boss is finally succumbing to the paranoia that eats every old syndicate head alive eventually." He took a slow sip of scotch. "I threw plates against the wall. I sent men to the hospital over food that smelled too sweet." He paused. "When I was 12 years old, my father hosted a dinner. He was brokering peace with a rival family, the Marchettis. There was music, flowers, the most expensive food in the city." Sarah set her chopsticks down, turning fully toward him. The kitchen had gone perfectly still. "My mother hated this life," he said. "Hated every part of it, but she loved my father and she loved me. She sat right beside me that night. They brought out the main course, a braised fish in white wine. She took the first bite. His voice went hollow, distant, the practiced flatness of a man who had learned to survive his own memories by refusing to feel them. It was a neurotoxin, odorless. Tasteless, the Marchettis had paid off the head chef. It took 30 seconds. She grabbed her throat. She couldn't breathe. He looked at a spot on the marble that wasn't there. "I was 12, Sarah. I sat there in a suit my mother had picked out for me, holding her hand while she died on the floor." A suffocating silence fell over the kitchen. Sarah felt tears burn the back of her eyes. "I was the one who found the antidote in the medicine cabinet upstairs, 10 minutes too late," he said, so quietly she almost missed it. "I've spent every year since telling myself 10 minutes would have been enough if I'd only known where to look faster. It never leaves you, that math." 10 minutes, my father killed everyone in that room," Seo-jun said, a dark edge creeping back into his voice. "The rivals, the servers, the chef, it didn't bring her back. From that day on, every plate put in front of me looked like a loaded gun." He turned to look at her, and for the first time since she'd met him, there was nothing guarded in his expression at all. "Food became my greatest fear. It became a weapon. I've spent 20 years waiting to die at every meal." He reached out slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, and when she didn't, his hand cupped the side of her face, thumb brushing her cheekbone. "Until you walked into my kitchen, defied every order I gave you, and served me a bowl of fire. For the first time in 20 years, I wasn't afraid." I felt warm. Sarah's heart slammed against her ribs. She couldn't look away. The ruthless syndicate boss was gone. In his place was a man who looked at her like she was the only solid ground left in his entire world. And in that moment, she understood, with a kind of dread that went all the way to her bones, that whatever this was, it wasn't Stockholm Syndrome. It was something far more permanent. She leaned into his touch. She could feel his breath against her lips, could feel the restrained tremor in his hand. He was going to kiss her, and it was going to change everything. A cell phone buzzed, harsh and sudden, shattering the moment like a gunshot. Seo-jun stiffened instantly, the vulnerability gone in a heartbeat, his instincts snapping back online. His hand fell away from her face, but it wasn't his phone. The sound was coming from a crate of vegetables by the sink, a delivery cleared by security hours earlier. Sarah stood, cold dread piercing through the lingering warmth. She dug through the crate and found, buried beneath the soul-dusted potatoes, a cheap burner phone wrapped in plastic. It was vibrating. "Don't answer it," Seo-jun ordered, already moving toward her. Her finger was already swiping the screen. "Hello," she whispered, static, breathing, then a voice thick, accented, cold. "Little chef," it said, "you ruined a very expensive arrangement when you tackled our boy's target. We are very displeased." Sarah's blood turned to ice. "Who is this? Check your messages." The line went dead. A notification popped up, a photo. Sarah opened it, and a horrified sob tore out of her throat before she could stop it. The phone slipped from her fingers and hit the marble. It was her father, Marcus Monroe, tied to a chair in a dark concrete room, his face swollen and bruised almost beyond recognition. Standing behind him with a knife to his throat was a man with a tattoo of a coiled serpent on his forearm, the mark of the Marchetti family. Seo-jun crossed the kitchen in a heartbeat, picking up the phone. His whole body went rigid. A text followed the photo, and he read it aloud, his voice devoid of any inflection at all. "He owes us 2 million. You took our man. Now you finish the job. Poison Seo-jun. You have 48 hours. If he's not dead by Sunday, we mail your father back to you one piece at a time." Sarah stumbled back against the counter, hands flying to her mouth. Everything she and Seo-jun had built in that kitchen, fragile and new, shattered into pieces around her. The Marchettis had found her. They had her father. She stared at the man she was already, impossibly, falling for, and understood the choice sitting in front of her would ruin them both no matter which way she turned. The clock on the wall ticked like the countdown it actually was. 36 hours had passed since the burner phone had shattered everything, 36 hours of stolen sleep and hollow silence. It was Friday night now, 12 hours left. The small glass vial smuggled into the penthouse that morning, hidden inside a hollowed-out truffle from a compromised delivery, sat like a stone in the pocket of Sarah's apron, odorless, tasteless. Guaranteed to stop a heart in under a minute and look exactly like a massive cardiac arrest, it was the instrument of her damnation. She stood at the island with hands that moved on frantic muscle memory, preparing a lavish braised short rib dish, pouring every ounce of her skill into what she knew, sickeningly, might be Han Seo-jun's last meal. The kitchen filled with the rich smell of soy, pear, sesame, and garlic, a dish of patience and comfort, prepared for a man she was supposed to kill. Her father was a deeply flawed man. A gambler, a liar, a coward who'd mortgaged his own daughter's future to feed an addiction he refused to fight. He'd failed her more times than she could count. But he was still the man who'd taught her to ride a bike, who'd held her hand and cried with her the night her mother died. Could she let him be tortured to death because she wouldn't pull the trigger, her fingers closed around the vial in her pocket? "It smells incredible," a voice said, and she spun around, heart lurching. Seo-jun stood in the archway, freshly showered, dark hair still damp, wearing a soft charcoal sweater that made him look nothing like the warlord who ran half the city. But it wasn't his appearance that stole her breath. It was his eyes, the guarded coldness gone, replaced by something warm and unguarded and completely trusting. He dismissed the guards to the outer perimeter. For the first time since she'd arrived, they were truly alone. He had given her his back. He'd given her his life. "You're working too hard," he murmured, crossing the kitchen to tuck a stray curl behind her ear. "You look pale, Sarah." "I'm fine," she lied, forcing a trembling smile. It's a complicated dish." He didn't push. He simply pressed a soft kiss to her forehead. "Come, let's eat. I want to taste what you've spent all day making." He walked to the small dining nook tucked into the corner and sat. Sarah stood frozen at the counter, the bowl steaming in front of her. "Do it," a frantic voice screamed in her head. "Pour it in. Save him. Walk away." Her hand shook violently as she pulled the vial from her apron and uncorked it. She stared at the dark, glossy sauce coating the beef. It would blend seamlessly. He would never smell it. 3 drops fell, vanishing without a trace. She recorked the vial, shoved it back in her pocket, and carried the bowl to the table with legs that felt made of lead. Seo-jun poured wine into 2 glasses, looking up at her without a shred of suspicion. "You aren't eating. I tasted it while cooking. I'm full," she whispered, eyes locked on his hands. He smiled, rare, beautiful, transforming his harsh features into something devastating. He picked up his fork. Time seemed to slow, thick and unbearable. Sarah could hear her own pulse roaring in her ears. He pressed the fork into the beef. It fell apart effortlessly. He gathered a piece, coated in sauce, and lifted it toward his mouth without a moment of hesitation. After 20 years of inspecting every plate for death, he was trusting her completely. The fork reached his lips. "No," the word tore out of her, raw and animal. She lunged across the table, slamming her hand into his wrist. The fork flew from his grip. The plate flipped, poisoned meat and rice crashing to the marble floor, the ceramic shattering into 100 pieces, dark sauce splattering across the white stone. Silence. Absolute deafening silence. Sarah lay half-sprawled across the table, chest heaving, a broken sob tearing loose. She had done it. She had saved him. And in doing so, she had just signed her own father's death warrant. The shift in Seo-jun was instant and total. The trusting man was gone, replaced in a heartbeat by the warlord who had survived a lifetime of betrayal. His eyes went dark and burning, the temperature of the room plummeting. He moved faster than she could track, one hand closed around her throat, not crushing, but absolute, hauling her over the table and pinning her against the wall. His other hand drew a weapon in a blur, pressing the cold steel of it under her chin. "Who?" he demanded, voice shaking with a fury that rattled the pots overhead. "Tell me who bought you, or I put a bullet in this wall next to your head." Tears streamed down Sarah's face. She didn't fight the hand at her throat or the gun against her jaw. Her hands came up instead, gripping the front of his sweater, holding on as her whole world came apart. "The Marchettis," she sobbed. "They put a phone in the vegetables. They have him, Seo-jun. They have my father." His jaw clenched so hard the muscle jumped, and you chose to kill me to save the man who sold you to a casino. I tried, she cried, refusing to look away from his rage. I put the drops in the sauce. I walked over here to watch you eat it, and I couldn't. Her voice broke completely. I couldn't do it. I chose you, and now they're going to kill him, and it's my fault. Please just kill me if you have to, but please don't let them hurt him. The words hung raw and bleeding in the freezing air. Seo-jun stared down at her, at the absolute terror in her eyes, and beneath the terror, the truth. She hadn't failed to poison him. She had chosen him at the very last second, with her own father's life on the line. The rage in his chest went suddenly, completely still, replaced by something that felt dangerously close to being loved. Slowly, the fire in his eyes banked into something colder and infinitely more dangerous, not toward her, but toward whoever had done this to her. He lowered the gun, released her throat, and cupped her face in both hands instead, thumbs wiping her tears away. He pulled her into his chest, burying his face in her hair. I'm not going to hurt you, he said, voice a low, rough promise. And they are not going to touch your father. Where is the phone? She pointed with a shaking hand. He crossed the kitchen, grabbed the burner, and traced its last signal through an encrypted app on his own phone. Within 30 seconds, he had coordinates, an abandoned warehouse on the South Docks. He pressed a button on his earpiece. Full mobilization, he said, and his voice carried the finality of a declaration of war. Heavy weapons suppressed. Target is a Marchetti stronghold on the South Docks. Perimeter established in 20 minutes. No survivors unless I say otherwise. He turned back to Sarah, took her face in his hands, and kissed her once, hard and certain. Lock the doors. Don't open them for anyone but me. I'm bringing him back to you. He was gone before she could answer, no longer a man, a force of nature walking out into the night, and hell was going with him. Rain hammered the docks as a convoy of black SUVs killed their headlights and rolled to a silent stop outside a rusted warehouse. The Marchettis thought they were untouchable. They thought they'd cornered the head of the Baekdu Combine using a civilian chef. It was the last mistake most of them would ever make. Seo-jun stepped out into the storm, soaked instantly, a tactical vest strapped over black tactical gear, a suppressed rifle in his hands, his expression carved from stone. 30 armed men fell in around him without a word, fanning out along the perimeter with the silent discipline of men who had done this before and expected to do it again. He raised 2 fingers toward the steel doors. Breach. The assault was brutal and fast. Charges blew the hinges, the sound swallowed almost entirely by the rolling thunder overhead. Before the smoke cleared, Seo-jun was already inside, a dark shape moving through crates and rusted machinery. Clearing corners with the same mechanical efficiency he'd once used to unravel an enemy's finances from behind a desk. The guards inside, arrogant and unprepared, barely had time to reach for their weapons before his men cut them down one by one, the warehouse filling with short, controlled bursts of suppressed fire. He didn't slow, he didn't waste a single motion. Every man who stepped into his path became a problem solved in under 2 seconds. His focus narrowed to one single fact. Somewhere in this building was the man Sarah had risked everything to save. And he was going to walk out of here carrying him. He found Marcus Monroe in a reinforced office at the center of the warehouse, unconscious, his face a mask of bruises. Standing over him was the same man from the photo, the serpent tattoo visible on his forearm, eyes going wide with sudden terror as he realized his fortress had fallen in under 3 minutes. The man went for his weapon. Seo-jun didn't bother with his rifle. He crossed the room and ended it before the man's hand had cleared leather. You touched what's mine, he said quietly, and it was the last thing the man ever heard. Seo-jun cut Marcus free, hauled him over one shoulder, and walked out through the warehouse, every hostile body in the building silent behind him. Burn it, he told his lieutenant on the way out, carrying Sarah's father into the rain. Burn it to the ground. He'd made his choice. He'd unleashed everything he had, and now he was going home. The storm that battered Ridgeport that night turned the skyline into a blurred smear of neon and shadow. Inside the fortified penthouse, Sarah hadn't moved from the kitchen in hours. The shattered plate still lay scattered across the marble, the ruined sauce smeared like a warning she couldn't bring herself to clean up. She could have run. Nobody would have stopped her. Instead, her feet stayed rooted to the floor, waiting. At exactly 3:14 in the morning, the elevator chimed. Sarah's breath caught as the doors slid open and Seo-jun stepped into the foyer, soaked to the bone, his tactical vest torn and smeared with grease and blood. his face pale but his eyes finding her instantly. He didn't walk, he staggered, leaning hard against the doorframe of the kitchen, a violent shudder running through him. A dark stain was spreading fast across his side. Seo-jun, Sarah rushed forward, closing the distance in a heartbeat. He's safe, he rasped, catching her shoulders to steady himself, leaving bloody handprints on her coat. My men intercepted the transport. Your father's in a secure medical facility. He'll be on a flight out of the country by tomorrow night with a new name and enough money that he never sees the inside of a casino again. A sob of pure relief tore out of her. He'd done it. He'd walked into hell and brought her father back exactly like he'd promised. The Marchettis, she whispered, staring at the blood coating his hands. Gone, he said, dark satisfaction flickering behind the exhaustion. He took a step toward the hallway and his leg buckled. Sarah caught him, bracing her whole body against his weight. You're shot, a graze and a knife. It'll heal, just get me to a chair. No. We're not doing a chair, and we're not waiting for luck to fix that. Sarah's fear burned away into the same steely authority she used running a kitchen under pressure. She half-carried him to the marble island. Up, he obeyed, hoisting himself onto the counter with a pained laugh at her tone. Sarah flew to the cabinets, found the trauma kit his security kept stocked, snapped on gloves, and got to work, cutting away his ruined shirt, cleaning and pressure-packing the knife wound. Working with the same fierce precision, she used plating a dish under a ticking clock. He didn't flinch when she poured antiseptic into the wound, though the roar that tore out of him cracked something in the marble under his hands. She kept going anyway, steady, focused, until the bleeding stopped and the bandages were secure. She worked in silence for a long stretch, her fingers sure even when her nerves weren't, and somewhere in the middle of it she realized she'd stopped being afraid of him entirely. Not because he was weak, sitting there bleeding on her makeshift operating table, but because of what he'd done to get here, because a man capable of tearing a warehouse apart for her father hadn't once, in 5 days of captivity, actually hurt her. Not even when she'd given him every reason to. It's done, she whispered finally, stripping off the bloody gloves. He was looking at her the way he had that first night over the bowl of noodles, except there was nothing guarded left in it at all. She stood there in the wreckage of the kitchen, covered in his blood, hair falling loose from her braid, and she wasn't looking at him with fear. She was looking at him like she'd already made her choice a long time ago. You didn't run, he said quietly. No, she breathed, stepping closer. I didn't. You've seen what I am now, Sarah. The blood I carry, if you stay in this with me, I will never let you go. I don't want you to, she said, cupping his face, feeling his pulse hammer under her palm. I chose you before the guns. Before any of this, I'm not afraid of the dark, and I'm not afraid of you. Something in him broke open, quiet, raw, years in the making. He pulled her close, and this time when their mouths met, there was nothing holding either of them back. It was tender in a way neither of them had expected to feel again. Two people who had spent years bracing for betrayal, finally choosing, deliberately, to stop. What followed that night belonged to the two of them alone, the storm outside, the wreckage of the kitchen around them, two survivors finally letting their guard down at the same time. Morning came pale and gray through the tall windows, and Sarah woke to cold, empty space beside her. She sat up, pulling the sheet around herself, and found Seo-jun standing at the foot of the bed, fully dressed, sharp charcoal suit, tie perfectly knotted. Every trace of the man from the kitchen locked back behind the armor of the syndicate boss. Only his eyes gave him away, dim with something that looked a lot like grief. Your father's plane lands in 6 hours, he said, voice carefully flat. His debts are paid. His new life is funded. I know, Sarah said softly, dread pooling in her stomach. You told me, I also told you what I am. He reached into his jacket and set 3 items on the dresser, slow and deliberate. I'm a warlord, Sarah. The Marchettis are gone, but there will be others. There is always someone else looking to take the crown. I refuse to watch this life turn you into someone you're not. She looked at the dresser, a new passport with her photo and a different name, a black duffel bag, a key card. There's enough in that bag to disappear completely, he said, and his voice tightened with the effort of saying it. The passport's real. The card overrides the lockdown. My men have been told to let you pass. He was giving her everything, freedom, money, a way out. He was tearing his own heart out because he genuinely believed his darkness would eventually ruin her. I have a meeting to restructure the territories, he said, turning away so she wouldn't see whatever was in his eyes. I'll be back at 8 tonight. If you're gone, I won't come looking. You have my words, you're free. He walked out, and the door clicked shut behind him with a terrible kind of finality. The day was its own quiet form of torture for both of them. Seo-jun sat through hours of meetings, reassigning territory, issuing orders in a voice that never wavered, utterly hollow inside every second of it. Every time he closed his eyes, he smelled smoked pork belly and gochugaru. He felt her hands pressing against his bleeding side. He heard her voice telling him she wasn't afraid of the dark. He'd done the right thing. He'd let her go to save her from himself. The cost was going to be a lifetime of empty rooms. At exactly 8 o'clock, his SUV pulled into the underground garage. He rode the elevator up in silence, bracing for the quiet of an empty penthouse. The doors slid open, and the penthouse wasn't dark. It wasn't silent. Warm light spilled across the hardwood, and the air was thick with garlic and ginger and wild mushrooms, and something that smelled impossibly like home. Seo-jun's chest seized. He dropped his briefcase and walked fast down the hallway, stopping dead in the kitchen archway. The marble floor had been scrubbed clean of blood and broken porcelain. Standing at the stove, wooden spoon in hand, barefoot, her hair pulled into a loose knot, wearing one of his own oversized white dress shirts, was Sarah. She hadn't taken the money. She hadn't taken the passport. She turned to face him, and there was no hesitation in her eyes at all, only the calm certainty of a woman who'd already claimed her territory. Seo-jun couldn't speak. The man who'd ordered 30 deaths without blinking the night before stood frozen in his own doorway, completely undone by the sight of her in his shirt. Sarah lifted a steaming bowl off the counter and slid it across the marble toward him, a simple bowl of spicy oxtail stew, the very first dish she'd ever cooked for him. The one that had cracked him wide open. I tore up the passport, she said, voice steady and full of finality. I'm not running, I'm not hiding. And I'm definitely not your chef anymore. She reached across the island, curling her fingers into his tie and pulling him down until his forehead nearly touched hers. Sit down, she whispered against his mouth, and eat. She wasn't his prisoner anymore. She wasn't his employee. She was the fire he'd stopped being afraid of, standing in his kitchen, choosing him on purpose. And Han Seo-jun, the most feared man in Ridgeport, sat down, picked up the spoon and let her feed him. Outside, the storm that had chased them through the worst week of both their lives had finally broken, leaving the skyline washed clean and glittering under a clear night sky. Somewhere across the city, in a hospital room he'd paid to keep quiet, Marcus Monroe was sleeping off the worst of his injuries. Alive because his daughter had refused to let go of either of the men she loved. And here, in a kitchen that had seen gunfire, betrayal, and a poison meant to end everything. Two people who had spent their whole lives bracing for the next disaster finally let themselves believe there might not be one coming. I'm still going to yell at you about the passport, Seo-jun said eventually, a bowl of stew halfway to his mouth, the first real smile she'd seen from him tugging at one corner of his mouth. You can try, Sarah said, leaning against the counter beside him, watching him eat like it was the only thing in the world worth watching. I'll just make you another bowl of this until you forget what you were mad about. That, he said quietly, sounds like a very dangerous plan, Miss Sarah. Good, she said. I've heard danger suits you, and that's how you thaw out a man who forgot how to trust anyone. If this story got its hooks in you, the way it got into mine while I wrote it, do me a favor, hit subscribe so you never miss the next one, drop a like. And tell me in the comments if you'd have thrown that first pot of oxtail stew away too. I'll see you in the next chapter. Welcome again to TasteRomance Stories.